Anti-predation is the idea that the violence inherent to the natural world is not necessarily something that should be accepted. They believe that we should use technology and philosophy to alter the world into a more just state. Today, Post-Comprehension will come on to explain his views. So, how would you define anti-predation?
Anti-predation is a moral position that, while understanding the roles and functions that predation currently plays in the ecosystem, is nonetheless immoral due to the limitations and suffering it inflicts on life forms and should be abolished. This includes both the prey's traumatic struggle and the predator's involuntary need to kill in order to survive, as the ecosystem itself has no feelings or grand design, and as natural phenomena go through a gradual process of evolutionary actions and reactions. The status quo of an environment is thus set only for further adaptation to violate it and establish a new status quo. In our stance, it is then imperative to reduce as much suffering as possible and not maintain some illusion that this suffering is for the sake of an arbitrary natural harmony, or given to the fantasy that non-humans live in an idyllic wild, or that human intervention is inherently bad.
How is this related to vegetarianism and veganism?
By evaluating the question of who is and isn't a moral subject worth considering, we're already approaching vegetarian and veganist theory. The anti-predationist says that all life, irrespective of species ranking, is valuable and worth considering. This defies speciesist notions of human supremacy, which can come in many forms. Two examples of which are: 1. Only valuing humanity is worthy of personhood and safety, while all other animals are considered inferior and only deemed valuable as merely sustenance for human prosperity. Another example of human supremacism, more common, agrees with the first but says that certain species are off limits for consumption because of their value as human companions. So for example, in America and Europe, dogs and cats are usually privileged as worthy of love, affection, and comfort because they are viewed as worthy companions, so they are considered pets, while pigs and cows and chickens are considered unworthy of such privileges and deemed food. This distinction between which non-human is a pet and which is food is decided through the hierarchical position that humanity has amassed over the rest of the animal kingdom. Already we're deep into and have crossed over into vegetarianism and veganist theory. However, it also questions and criticizes those forms of veganism and vegetarianism that say humanity eating non-human animals is wrong, but non-human animals eating each other is fine. This too is decided through that position that humanity has amassed. It's one thing to say that non-human predation has a function, and that there isn't a way to currently remove it, but it's another to proclaim this as morally good and appeal to naturalistic fallacies. Essentially, you are drawing a line in the sand that says human affairs and cruelties between one another are important, while non-human affairs are only important as long as they serve some imagined notion of natural harmony. The untold amounts of murder, rape, torture, and even war between ants and chimpanzees, for example, who have engaged in wars between themselves, that happen are merely nature playing itself out, while these same activities in human affairs are unnatural abominations. Being would argue that all of this is natural, everything from the coconut to the hand grenade. However, rape, no matter how natural it is wrong because it violates the consent of others and removes their agency from the equation. Both human and non-human abusers are bad. In this way, anti-predation is against both predatory consumption and sexual predation. So while, again, anti-predation is opposed to variations of veganism and vegetarianism that are morally fine with non-human predation, but anti-predationists are in support of, and often are, vegans who are not morally fine with any predation. It would be odd for being to complain about non-human predation, but be fine with the meat industry after all. That too houses untold numbers of acts of cruelty and oppression, which are often defended with appeals to nature. Humans are omnivores, but require meat for protein. This ignores the blight of the factory cow, whose existence is reduced to constantly giving birth to produce milk, only to see its male offspring constantly murdered. And then, on the other side, lions are carnivores and therefore have to eat the gazelle. This is just the way of nature, which ignores the pain of the frantically running gazelle as it screams for life before being devoured. Both of these claims say that these natural limitations are justified, inherently good, or at least they are dismissive of any skepticism about their morality. Obviously, there are differences here. Humans are able to have more of an option than the lion because of their privileged stature, omnivorism, and technological capabilities. But the point of this analogy is, just because something developed a certain way and serves a function doesn't mean it's inherently good or the only way forever. If you were to learn anything from nature, it's to stop selling it so short in the ways it can surprise you.
Why should animals exist in the first place if they're likely to suffer for centuries before we can end predation?
While they are suffering, and it may take centuries for them to attain freedom, possibly millennia, to pull out guns and end their misery immediately with mass murder would be horrifically naive. Not only would that guarantee the end of non-humanity, but also humanity, considering both are deeply interlinked on this planet. Non-humanity, and by extension humanity, should continue to exist because of the value we place on living as conscious beings. Even if it will take a while to end suffering, we should strive for the more difficult route of attaining freedom for all, irrespective of species, instead of simply resigning to extinction, even though it will take hundreds, possibly thousands of years to see a cosmos filled with trans-species solidarity.
How could this be achieved?
Good question. It depends on which anti-predationist you ask. Some have theorized certain solutions involving genetic alteration. One example is something called herbivorizing predators. This means turning carnivorous animals into herbivores through genetic modification or artificial selection, so that over time, these animals no longer need or want to kill other animals to survive. Of course, even the people advocating for this are cautious and would prefer more scientific research to be done so that such practices could be safely and effectively administered. Being is apprehensive regarding this approach, given that, from an anarchist point of view, the immediate worry being would have is the hierarchical abuses and sabotages of such a practice. There's also the question of how easily to do this without harming the animals or causing wider ecological consequences that would wipe everyone out, unless there was a way to do this through altering the environment to where having fewer predators wouldn't cause any problems. For being, there aren't any answers right now for abolishing predation, and so the usefulness of anti-predation in the present works as such. One, it's an important philosophical experiment and examination that criticizes human supremacy and the idea that suffering is inherently good. Two, helps towards vegan activism and the abolition of human predation on non-humans, one side of anti-predation. Three, reducing wild animal suffering by helping them providing aid to injured animals in the wild. And four, developing research for abolishing predation in the future.
Presumably, you're okay with killing and consuming plants or a fungus like yeast. As I'm sure you know, these organisms have incredibly basic nervous systems. You could also imagine the transitionary period between single-celled organisms and animals being very complicated, with the line between simple response to stimuli and actual desire for life being very blurry. How do we determine which things are and are not capable of lack of consent?
Ideally, we'd want to open up the possibility for plants, fungi, and even single-celled organisms to have freedom from suffering and be able to expand their own agencies as well. Of course, this is a much further off goal. Being's not going to decry you if you say remove black mold from your house or kill a poisonous insect out of self-defense, given you don't have many options in those situations. This runs back to how Being was talking about predatory species not having many options in their own circumstances. So yeah, humans still have to eat to survive, and Being did rule out extinction, so eating plants, fruits, and so on are an advisable alternative to eating meat right now. So the matter of who is and isn't capable of consent, or who we give rights to, is shifted towards focusing on expanding as much agency and consent to as many living creatures as we can as the future develops. Possibly in the far, far, far future, we will even give life to dead matter, or even provide autonomy to each individual cell.
What are your thoughts on the natural selection element of this? Could less threats within an ecosystem lead to weaker animals that are more susceptible to extinction?
The goal of anti-predation is to create a participatory environment free from suffering and abuse. So in regards to weakening animals, Being would argue that giving them these abilities to break away from danger would make them stronger and more complex as creatures, as they're able to develop further in their own individuality and plurality in the ecology. Pairing this with the transhumanist notion of morphological freedom would mean that each life form would be able to dive into their own evolutionary process without leaving it to the arbitrary cruelty of natural selection, which doesn't inherently make any creature stronger or better, but is merely a mechanism of adaptation within a given environment, which at any point could change and immediately put that creature in danger, irrespective of previous adaptability. There's also the simple fact that no matter how quick or strong you are, a random incident could wipe you and your genetics out, such as a boulder coming down a mountain and landing on top of you.
What is the benefit of expanding agency to things like cells? Why is that a good thing to do? Many would argue that the existence of decision-making and conscious experience is the cause of all suffering in the first place. How would you respond to this?
The expansion of agency and consciousness correlates to the expansion of knowledge, choice, and the freedoms that those provide in overcoming the limitations of ignorance and the bonds of inabilities, not to be confused with disability, which can be an inability or a limitation on someone, but it can also be a different form of ability that is merely outside social norms or present ideas of the physiological status quo. Being would argue that in order to maximize liberty, autonomy, and its complexity, assuming these are things you value and want, we should push all boundaries that prevent conscious actors from engaging in interactivities and disactivities freely. This would entail welcoming as many actors as possible, no matter species, size, or so on. So then, this may present us with something as impossible sounding as cellular autonomy. It's true that a rock, for example, isn't suffering, but it isn't doing much else either. And it definitely has no say in anything going on involving its own structural integrity, whereabouts, or much of anything else. While decision-making and conscious experience open up the possibility and growth of suffering, the same is true for pleasure. However, conscious experience doesn't have to inherently involve either, as being would push for a world with more pleasure and far less suffering. Of course, without conscious activity, nervous systems, and so on, there wouldn't be suffering because there wouldn't be perceived concepts in general. But as a conscious being, a lack of conscious activity isn't much of a freeing condition either. Rather, a different kind of tyranny presents itself there, that of a state of absolute despotic happenstance where any stronger force can destroy another at any moment throughout the mechanics of unconscious cause and effect.
There are benefits to diversity, genetic and otherwise, across all forms of life. Granting greater intelligence and ability to those that do not presently have it could in some way be said to decrease diversity. Is it a concern that, as we grant traits considered to be desirable to more and more of the living population, we decrease this ecological diversity? How do we avoid everybody augmenting themselves or others into perfect entities by the standards of society, and in doing so removing diversity?
For being an effective way against attempts to impose systemized eugenic schemes or more informal abuses such as social pressures that force others to adjust their own physical image in a way that is counter to the one they desire, is done through synthesizing the anarchist opposition to hierarchical society into anti-predation, as these pressures in existing society have already committed such atrocities on their own populations. With this in mind, not all anti-predationists are anarchists, so you may find a different response to this question from more politically liberal or more generally statist anti-predationists. But to ensure that augmentation and cross-species relations remain free and unobstructed by inequalities, such as those abusive social and elite pressures that violate bodily autonomy and enforce speciesism, it is necessary to organize and even perform unorganized activities against those bigoted mentalities and actors that seek to keep others subdued by oppression. In regards to ecological diversity, being will split things into two frames. One is the pictured forest of natural selection, and the other is the pictured forest of participatory selection, if you will. The first scenery is imagined as ideal and drawn with a fantastical brush, but if we looked closer, we would find that as mass and elite pressures exist to prevent free human society, similar pressures exist in a non-conscious and more frantic form in the non-human world by killing off any life form there is that is incapable of avoiding predation or at least dying before mating, irrespective of their own individual lives and the bonds they've created with those around them. In this way, any diversity that is unable to reproduce itself fast enough before death is destroyed. Any diversity of bonds and relationships is destroyed if it isn't capable of adapting itself to existing conditions. Never mind that this diversity could be advantageous elsewhere, or in a way beyond simply reproducing or throwing off predators. It is still pressured out of existence by natural selection. Participatory selection imagines its forests as uniquely tailored to each individual life form's desire, as long as it isn't oppressing another. The diversity of violence and ruthless power would be removed, sure, but a diversity of mutual aid and uplifting would be embraced here, creating an ecology that is made up of liberatory diversity rather than one built toward or around violence and quick reproduction.
Are there any present-day ways somebody could work toward anti-predation, even in minor ways?
It can be something as small as critiquing human supremacy as the first step towards rethinking the relationship between humanity and non-humanity. Hopefully this will lead to such actions as providing comfort and aid to wounded and sick animals whenever you can, possibly moving away from eating animal products, even taking direct action against those industries that harm and exploit our non-human friends. These are just some of the minor ways that humanity can currently work toward anti-predation.
Do you believe the world is heading toward anti-predation? Or do you believe the world is moving toward more coercive systems at the moment?
Toward anti-predation? Not currently. Towards more coercive systems? Perhaps. Globalization has provided humanity with some unique tools that could lead it towards greater mutual cooperation and destiny, or they could fall short of this and remain divided, not only with other species, but within their own. It seems that the divide and conflict between humanity and non-humanity will continue for a while, possibly coming to a grim end as climate catastrophes increase and worsen already chaotic tensions. The path before us right now seems open for the total extinction of life on this planet, or perhaps things will change and move towards the total expansion of life.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
Like the myth of Prometheus, who betrayed the gods to give humanity fire, so too must humanity betray its leaders to give fire to the rest of those who dwell on the earth.
Are there any books, videos, podcasts you have to recommend on the topic?
Being's videos on anti-predation and Gothic humanism on the Post-Comprehension channel. Outside of Being's own work on the subject, you can look into Cadiaferia's Animal Ethics in the Wild. The book is a good introduction into the ethics for why humanity should intervene in the non-human world and help lessen the suffering of wild animals, as well as David Pierce's work concerning the abolition of pain and the Twitter page/website Herbivorizing Predators for other perspectives on the topic.
Where can people find you?
You can find Being at Post-Comprehension on YouTube, which covers a wide variety of topics outside the 2 videos mentioned.
Thank you for watching, and thanks again to Being from Post-Comprehension for coming on. You can find the link to his channel in the description, and you can also watch our previous video together.